Why you would not survive life in ancient Egypt. Welcome, dear traveler, to this quiet corner of the night. As you settle into your bed, or perhaps your favorite chair, let your breathing slow and your mind wander with me. We're about to embark on a journey, not through space, but through time. Back, far back, to a land that exists now only in memory and sand. Tonight, we'll explore ancient Egypt. But this won't be the Egypt of adventure films or romantic paintings. No, tonight we'll see the Egypt that most people actually lived in. The Egypt of dust and toil, of hunger and disease, of dangers lurking in every shadow and every sunrise. Before we begin, take a moment. Where are you right now? What time is it in your part of the world? Whether it's the deep hours of night or the soft gray of early morning, you're welcome here. If you find yourself enjoying these gentle explorations of history, I hope you'll return for more. But for now, let's turn our attention to the Nile. The great river, the giver of life, the maker of civilizations. But also, as we'll discover, something far more complicated than that. Let me start with something simple. A day. An ordinary day in ancient Egypt, perhaps around 1400 BC, during what historians call the New Kingdom. The sun rises, as it always does, over the eastern cliffs, and in a small village near the river, a farmer named Khai wakes up. Khai is not his real name. We don't know his real name. He left no tomb, no inscription, no monument. He's simply one of the millions who lived and died along the Nile, leaving barely a trace. But let's imagine him for a moment. Let's follow him through his day. The first thing Khai notices is thirst. His mouth is dry, his lips cracked. He slept on a reed mat on the floor of a single-room mud brick house, and the night, though cool, has left him parched. He rises, careful not to wake his wife and 3 children sleeping nearby. The 4th child, a baby daughter, died 2 months ago, but we'll come to that later. Khai walks outside into the pre-dawn darkness. The village is silent except for the distant braying of a donkey. He walks toward the river, perhaps 50 paces from his home, to drink and to fill a clay jar with water. This simple act, this morning routine that takes perhaps 5 minutes, contains within it a dozen ways to die. The Nile, you see, is not clean water. It's alive with parasites. There's a tiny flatworm, invisible to the naked eye, that penetrates human skin upon contact with the water. This parasite, which modern medicine calls schistosomiasis, was present in nearly every body of water in ancient Egypt. It burrows into the bloodstream and eventually makes its way to the intestines or bladder, where it lays eggs. Over years, it causes chronic pain, bloody urine, exhaustion, and eventually organ failure. Nearly every mummy examined by modern archaeologists shows signs of this parasitic infection. Rich and poor alike. It was simply part of life, part of the price of living beside the river. But the parasites are just the beginning. As Khai kneels by the water's edge in the growing light, he's also vulnerable to crocodiles. The Nile crocodile is one of nature's most efficient predators. Growing up to 20 feet long and weighing over 1,000 pounds, these creatures can remain perfectly still for hours, submerged with only their eyes above water, waiting. A crocodile strike is explosively fast. The massive jaws clamp down with bone-crushing force, and then comes the death roll. The crocodile spins rapidly in the water, disorienting its prey, drowning it, tearing flesh from bone. For Khai, one moment of inattention could mean a violent, terrifying end in the muddy waters. But let's say Khai is lucky this morning. He fills his jar, drinks deeply despite the risk of parasites, and returns to his home. His wife, Merit, is awake now, grinding barley between 2 stones to make flour for bread. This is women's work, and it will occupy several hours of her day. The grinding stones slowly shed tiny particles of granite into the flour. Over years, this grit wears down teeth to the nerve, causing abscesses and agonizing pain. Dental problems were epidemic in ancient Egypt. Even young adults often had severely worn, infected teeth. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. It's still early morning, and Khai has work to do. He eats a small breakfast, bread and onions, perhaps a handful of dates if the family has been fortunate. Then he walks to the fields. Khai is a farmer, like perhaps 80% of ancient Egypt's population. He doesn't own his land. It belongs to the estate of a nobleman who serves in the pharaoh's court in Thebes. Khai is allowed to farm a small plot in exchange for giving more than half his harvest to the estate. This is how the system works. This is how it has always worked. The sun is fully up now, and already the heat is building. By midday, temperatures will soar past 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Khai will work through it all. There's no choice. The barley must be tended, the irrigation channels maintained, the weeds pulled. He works bent over, his back aching. The sun beats down mercilessly on his head and shoulders. By afternoon, his dark skin will be even darker, baked by the relentless Egyptian sun. Sweat pours off him, depleting his body of water and salt. Heat exhaustion is a constant threat. Every year, workers drop dead in the fields, their hearts simply giving out in the brutal heat. The irrigation system requires constant maintenance. Water must be lifted from the Nile or from canals and poured into the fields. This is done with a device called a shadaf, a long pole with a bucket on one end and a counterweight on the other. It's simple but backbreaking. Hour after hour, bending, lifting, pouring. Bending, lifting, pouring. The repetitive motion causes severe strain on the lower back and shoulders. Skeletal remains from ancient Egypt show widespread spinal damage, especially among the working class. As Khai works, he must also watch for snakes. The Egyptian cobra, the horned viper, the carpet viper, all are deadly. A bite from any of them could kill him within hours. There are also scorpions hiding under rocks and in crevices. Their sting is agonizing, and for children or the elderly, sometimes fatal. Midday comes. Khai rests briefly in whatever shade he can find, perhaps under a palm tree at the edge of the field. He eats more bread, drinks water. The water is warm and tastes of mud, but it's all there is. Then back to work. The afternoon stretches on endlessly. The sun seems to pause in its arc across the sky, as if deliberately prolonging the suffering. Khai's thoughts wander. He thinks about the harvest coming in 3 months. Will it be enough? The estate will take its share first. Then the tax collectors will come. They always come. If the harvest is poor, if the Nile's flood was insufficient, if the gods are displeased, then Khai might not have enough left to feed his family through the year. This fear, this fundamental uncertainty, is the background noise of his entire life. One bad harvest away from starvation. One drought away from losing everything. And indeed, droughts did happen. The Nile is fed by rains falling far to the south, in the Ethiopian highlands. If those rains fail, then months later, the Nile's annual flood fails as well. The flood is everything. It deposits fresh silt on the fields, making them fertile. It provides water for the coming growing season. Without it, Egypt dies. There's an inscription from around 2200 BC, during a period historians call the First Intermediate Period, when centralized government collapsed and chaos reigned. A nobleman named Ankatafi describes conditions during a severe drought. All of Upper Egypt was dying of hunger. People were eating their children. Let that sink in for a moment. Eating their children. This is not metaphor or exaggeration. In the most desperate famines, when grain stores were exhausted and no relief came, people made unthinkable choices to survive. But let's return to Khai. It's late afternoon now, and finally, mercifully, the sun begins its descent toward the western cliffs. Khai finishes his work and walks home, his body aching in every joint and muscle. He's only 30 years old, but his body feels ancient. At home, Merit has prepared a simple dinner. Bread, onions, lentils cooked into a paste. If they're fortunate, there might be a small piece of dried fish. Meat is rare, reserved for festivals or for the tables of the wealthy. The family eats together in the growing darkness. There's no lamp. Oil for lamps is expensive. They have perhaps one small lamp that's lit only when absolutely necessary. After dinner, there's a bit of time before sleep. Perhaps Khai plays with his children, tells them a story. Perhaps he and Merit talk quietly about the day, about their worries, about the future. But soon exhaustion takes over. They lie down on their reed mats. The night creatures begin their chorus. Somewhere in the distance, a jackal howls. And Khai sleeps, his body briefly released from toil, before the cycle begins again tomorrow. This is an ordinary day. Not a bad day, not a particularly good day, just ordinary. And yet, as we've seen, it's filled with dangers and hardships that would be almost incomprehensible to someone living in the modern, developed world. But we've only glimpsed the surface. Let's go deeper. Let's talk about childhood. Merit, Khai's wife, has been pregnant 7 times in her life. She's 32 years old. Of those 7 pregnancies, 3 ended in miscarriage or stillbirth. Of the 4 children born alive, 1, as we mentioned, died at 2 months old. Another died at age 4 from what we now recognize as dysentery. So there are 2 surviving children, ages 8 and 6. This is, sadly, a fairly typical experience for ancient Egyptian families. Infant mortality rates in ancient Egypt are estimated at around 30 to 40%. That means that of every 3 babies born, 1 would die before their first birthday. Those who survived infancy still faced tremendous risks. Overall, roughly half of all children died before age 5. The causes were many. Malnutrition weakened children's immune systems. Infectious diseases swept through communities regularly. Measles, whooping cough, various fevers. Without antibiotics, these childhood illnesses were often fatal. Accidents were common. Children drowned in canals and the river. They were bitten by snakes or scorpions. They fell from roofs or were trampled by animals. And then there were the parasites. In addition to schistosomiasis, there were guinea worms that grew up to 3 feet long inside the body, emerging slowly and agonizingly through the skin. There were tapeworms and roundworms that stole nutrients from growing children. Malaria was endemic in some regions, causing fever, anemia, and organ failure. The archaeological evidence is heartbreaking. In ancient cemeteries, tiny graves are everywhere. Small limestone coffins barely 2 feet long. Some contain mummified infants with their toys, a wooden horse, a bowl made of rags, a doll with jointed limbs. Parents who had so little gave what they could to comfort their dead children in the afterlife. The emotional toll must have been staggering. Yet it was so common that it was simply accepted as the way of things. Many parents didn't give their children names until they'd survived their first year, protecting themselves from becoming too attached to an infant who might not live. And for mothers, pregnancy and childbirth were themselves life-threatening. Without modern medical knowledge or technology, complications during childbirth killed many women. A baby positioned wrong in the birth canal could mean death for both mother and child. Hemorrhaging after delivery could drain a woman's life away in minutes. Infections of the uterus or birth canal, caused by unsterile conditions, could lead to agonizing death from sepsis. Midwives attended births, but their knowledge was limited. They relied on a combination of practical experience and magical incantations. They might press a woman's abdomen to try to reposition a baby or give her herbal concoctions to speed labor. But if serious complications arose, there was often nothing to be done but wait and pray. Some medical papyri contain instructions for determining if a woman will survive a difficult childbirth. One test involved placing a clove of garlic inside the woman. If the smell reached her breath, she would live. If not, she would die. This tells us something important. Physicians could predict death, but were often powerless to prevent it. Royal women were no exception. Several of the pharaoh's wives and daughters are known to have died in childbirth despite having access to the best medical care available. And if a woman survived childbirth, she would likely face many more pregnancies. Without reliable contraception, women bore children throughout their fertile years. Each pregnancy was another roll of the dice, another chance for complications, another risk of death. Imagine being married. Imagine knowing that each pregnancy might kill you. Imagine burying 4 of your 7 children. Imagine the constant, gnawing fear for the 2 who remain. And yet you go on. You grind grain, you weave cloth, you tend the home, you care for your family. Because what else can you do? This is resilience, yes, but it's also profound tragedy. Let's shift perspective for a moment. Let's move up the social hierarchy. We've been talking about farmers, the common people. But what about the nobles, the priests, the scribes? Surely their lives were easier. Yes and no. Certainly, the upper classes enjoyed privileges that Khai and Merit could never imagine. They had larger homes, better food, fine clothing, servants to do the most menial work. Scribes, in particular, had a relatively comfortable existence. There's an ancient Egyptian text called the Satire of the Trades that makes this point explicitly. There is no job without a supervisor except for the scribe. He is the supervisor. The text goes on to describe the miseries of various professions. The farmer covered in mud, the metalworker choking on fumes, the sandal maker begging for work. And in contrast, the scribe sits in clean white linen, writing and calculating, free from physical labor. But even the elite faced hardships we'd find shocking. Take disease. The wealthy had better nutrition, which helped, but they couldn't escape many of the afflictions that plagued everyone in ancient Egypt. Parasites didn't care about social class. Malaria struck rich and poor alike. Tuberculosis, which was common in ancient Egypt, could kill a nobleman as easily as a peasant. And the elite faced political dangers. Court intrigue could be deadly. A nobleman who fell out of favor with the pharaoh could lose everything: his position, his wealth, even his life. There are records of executions ordered by pharaohs for various offenses, real or imagined. One particularly chilling example comes from the reign of Ramesses III in the 12th century BC. A group of officials and members of the royal household, including one of the pharaoh's wives, conspired to assassinate him and place her son on the throne. The plot was discovered. The conspirators were arrested and tried. Some were executed. Others were forced to commit suicide. The inscriptions describing the trial are coldly bureaucratic in their detail, listing names and punishments with administrative efficiency. And Ramesses III himself, he may have been successfully assassinated despite the plot being discovered. His mummy shows that his throat was cut, suggesting he died violently. Even a living guard could be murdered in his own palace. For noble women, life had its own peculiar hardships. They had more autonomy than peasant women in some ways. They could own property, initiate divorce, participate in business. But they were also pawns in political marriages, married off to cement alliances or consolidate power. And they were expected to produce heirs, preferably male heirs. A noble wife who failed to bear sons might be cast aside, her position given to a more fertile woman. The royal family had it even stranger. To keep the royal bloodline pure, pharaohs sometimes married their own sisters or half-sisters. The genetic consequences of this inbreeding are visible in the archaeological record. Tutankhamun, the boy king whose tomb is one of the few royal burials to survive intact, had numerous health problems. His mummy shows a cleft palate, a club foot, and evidence of malaria. He probably walked with a cane and suffered from frequent illness. He died at 19, possibly from complications of a broken leg that became infected. This was a pharaoh, a living god, and yet his body was as fragile and vulnerable as any peasant's. Let's talk about the pharaohs more broadly, because the image we have of them, all-powerful, god-like, living in unimaginable luxury, is both true and misleading. Yes, pharaohs wielded absolute power in theory. Their word was law. They commanded armies, decided who lived and died, controlled the wealth of the entire nation. The monuments they built, the pyramids, the temples, the colossal statues, were testaments to their power and ego. But they were also men, and occasionally women, trapped by the expectations of their role. They were supposed to be living gods, the intermediaries between humanity and the divine. They were expected to maintain the cosmic order, the balance of the universe. Any failure, a military defeat, a bad flood, a plague, could be seen as a sign that the pharaoh had lost divine favor. And despite their power, they were mortal. They got sick, they aged, they died. And the preparations for death consumed vast resources and energy. The obsession with the afterlife that characterized ancient Egyptian culture reached its peak with the pharaohs. They built enormous tombs and filled them with treasures, furniture, food, everything they might need in the next world. They underwent mummification processes that lasted 70 days, with their organs removed and stored in special jars, their bodies dried with salt, wrapped in hundreds of yards of linen. And yet, for all this effort, most royal tombs were looted within a few generations, the treasures stolen, the mummies destroyed or defiled. The very immortality they sought to secure was violated by their own descendants and subjects, desperate for wealth in a harsh world. The Valley of the Kings, where New Kingdom pharaohs were buried in secret tombs carved into the cliffs, was systematically robbed in ancient times. We have trial records from the reign of Rameses IX describing tomb robberies. A metalworker named Amenpenufa confessed under torture. We opened their coffins and took the gold that we found. We took their amulets and jewels which were at their necks. We set fire to their coffins. Think about this. The pharaohs, with all their power, couldn't even protect their own bodies after death. The eternal rest they'd worked their entire lives to secure was disturbed by thieves looking for gold to sell for bread. It's both tragic and darkly ironic. The massive inequalities of Egyptian society meant that at the very bottom, people were so desperate they'd risk horrific execution to rob the dead. And at the very top, the pharaohs poured enormous resources into death preparations that ultimately failed. Let's talk about those executions, because the punishments for tomb robbery were designed to be as terrifying as possible to deter others from the same crime. Convicted tomb robbers were tortured during interrogation. The methods included beating the soles of feet with rods, twisting limbs, and other techniques designed to cause maximum pain. If found guilty, execution could take many forms. Impalement was common, the victim placed on a sharpened stake that slowly penetrated the body, causing death over hours or even days. Decapitation was considered a mercy by comparison. Some tomb robbers were burned alive. And in a final insult, their bodies were sometimes denied proper burial, dooming their souls to non-existence in the afterlife, according to Egyptian belief. It was a punishment that extended beyond death. Yet the tomb robberies continued. Because when you're starving, when your children are hungry, the risk of even the most horrific death might seem worth it for a chance at gold. This brings us to something we need to address directly: the forced labor that built Egypt's monuments. The pyramids, the temples, the grand palaces, all of it was built by human hands using the most primitive tools: copper chisels and saws, wooden mallets, stone hammers, ropes made of papyrus fiber, and human muscle. For a long time, there was a popular belief that the pyramids were built by slaves. More recent archaeological evidence suggests a more complex picture. Many of the workers were farmers doing corvée labor, a form of taxation where instead of giving grain, you gave your labor during the flood season when you couldn't farm anyway. But let's not romanticize this. Whether you call it corvée labor or slavery, the reality was the same for the workers. They were compelled to work on projects they didn't choose, doing backbreaking labor in harsh conditions for the glorification of rulers who viewed them as expendable. Archaeological excavations of workers' villages, like the one near the Giza pyramids, give us glimpses into their lives. They lived in barrack-style housing. They were fed rations of bread and beer. They worked in gangs, overseen by foremen with titles like Director of the King's Works. The skeletal remains tell stories of hard lives, spinal damage from carrying heavy loads, arthritis in shoulders and knees, broken bones that healed poorly, suggesting minimal medical care. Life expectancy for these workers was probably in the 30s. Some workers did take pride in their work. Graffiti left on pyramid blocks sometimes includes gang names like Friends of Khufu or Drunkards of Menkora. There's evidence of a community, of solidarity among the workers. They supported each other, mourned their dead, found moments of joy amid the hardship. But this doesn't change the fundamental exploitation at the heart of the system. The pharaohs commanded monuments to their own glory, while thousands suffered and died to build them. And it wasn't just the pyramids. Throughout Egyptian history, pharaohs launched massive building projects. Ramesses II, who reigned in the 13th century BC, was perhaps the most prolific builder in Egyptian history. He constructed temples across Egypt, added to existing ones, carved enormous statues of himself, and built a new capital city called Ramesses. All of this required vast amounts of labor, quarrying stone, transporting it hundreds of miles, carving it, erecting it, and all of it done by hand, by workers who had no choice but to serve. Let's shift topics slightly and talk about war, because ancient Egypt wasn't just a civilization of farmers and builders. It was also an empire built on military conquest. Egyptian armies campaigned regularly into Nubia to the south, Libya to the west, and the Levant to the northeast. These weren't defensive wars. They were wars of expansion and plunder. The goal was to extract tribute, capture slaves, and establish Egyptian dominance. For the pharaohs and generals, war was glorious. Victory inscriptions boast of enemies slaughtered, cities burned, captives taken. The walls of temples are covered with scenes of pharaohs in chariots, trampling enemies underfoot, smiting them with maces. But for the common soldiers, war was terrifying and brutal. Egyptian soldiers marched hundreds of miles through desert and hostile territory. They fought in the heat, wearing kilts and perhaps leather armor, carrying bronze-tipped spears and wooden shields. Hand-to-hand combat was chaotic and bloody. Men hacked at each other with axes and swords. Arrows and sling stones flew through the air. The wounded fell, crying out, and were trampled by those still fighting. If you were lucky enough to survive a battle, you still faced the march home. Many soldiers died on campaign from disease, exhaustion, or infected wounds. There was no rapid transport home for the wounded, no antibiotics for infections, no surgery to repair traumatic injuries. One Egyptian military text describes a campaign into Syria. The author describes the difficulties of the journey. The sky is darkened by day. The narrow valley is filled with boulders and pebbles. There is no room to pass. Thorns and brambles block the way. The ravine is on one side, the mountain rises on the other. Then he describes the terror of ambush. The enemy is hidden behind the bushes. There are Bedouins on this side and that. You hear the sound of arrows. Fear enters your heart. Your legs are trembling. This is a far cry from the triumphant scenes carved on temple walls. And if you were captured, your fate was grim. Prisoners of war were often executed on the spot, their bodies left for scavengers. Others were taken back to Egypt as slaves, branded with hot irons and set to work in the most brutal conditions. Some were used as sacrifices in religious ceremonies. Victory inscriptions sometimes quantify the slaughter. After one battle, Ramesses II claims to have killed 8,000 enemy soldiers and taken 7,000 prisoner. Whether these numbers are accurate or exaggerated doesn't really matter. What matters is that thousands died, and the pharaoh considered this a cause for celebration. For the civilians in conquered territories, the arrival of an Egyptian army meant disaster. Soldiers plundered towns, taking food, valuables, livestock. Men were killed or enslaved. Women and children were taken as captives. Entire populations were uprooted and marched to Egypt to work on building projects or farms. This was the Egyptian Empire, built not just on the labor of its own people, but on the conquered and enslaved peoples from surrounding regions. Now let's return to more everyday concerns. Let's talk about food. We mentioned earlier that Khai's diet consisted mainly of bread, onions, and occasional fish or fowl. This was typical for most Egyptians. Bread and beer were the staples. In fact, workers were sometimes paid in rations of bread and beer. But the bread wasn't like modern bread. It was coarse, made from emmer wheat or barley that was ground on stone querns. As we mentioned, tiny particles of stone mixed into the flour. But there was worse. The grain itself was often contaminated with sand, dirt, and chaff. No matter how carefully you tried to clean it, some debris remained. Eating this bread day after day, year after year, wore teeth down to nubs. Dental abscesses were extremely common and extremely painful. Without antibiotics or effective pain relief, an infected tooth could make your life miserable for weeks or months before either the infection subsided or killed you. Malnutrition was also widespread. While Egyptian art often depicts bountiful feasts with meat, bread, fruit, and vegetables in abundance, this was the diet of the elite, not the common people. Most Egyptians had a monotonous, carbohydrate-heavy diet lacking in protein, vitamins, and minerals. Studies of mummies show evidence of anemia, vitamin deficiencies, and stunted growth. Many people were shorter than they should have been because of childhood malnutrition. Their bones were less dense, making them more prone to fractures. Famines were a recurring threat. If the Nile's flood was inadequate for just 1 or 2 years in a row, food shortages could become severe. Grain stores might be emptied, prices would skyrocket, the poor would begin to starve. There are records of grain prices increasing tenfold during famines. For someone like Khai, who had little to no surplus wealth, this meant catastrophe. You couldn't simply pay more for food. You had no money. You survived on what you grew and what you were allowed to keep after taxes. If that wasn't enough, you starved. During severe famines, people resorted to desperate measures. They sold themselves or their children into slavery. They ate things normally considered inedible: grass, tree bark, even clay to fill their stomachs. And in the worst cases, as we mentioned earlier, they ate the dead or even killed to survive. The psychological trauma of living with this constant food insecurity is hard to imagine. Never knowing if next year's harvest will be enough. Never sure if your children will have enough to eat. Always aware that you're one bad flood away from disaster. Let's talk about medicine in more detail, because this is an area where the gap between ancient Egypt and the modern world becomes particularly stark. The ancient Egyptians were actually quite advanced in some areas of medicine. They recognized that the heart was important for circulation. They identified many diseases and injuries accurately. They performed surgery, set broken bones, and stitched wounds. But their understanding was limited by the knowledge of their time. They didn't know about germs or infection. They didn't understand how many diseases were transmitted. They attributed many illnesses to supernatural causes, angry guards, evil spirits, curses. Medical treatments were a bizarre mixture of practical remedies and magical thinking. A physician might prescribe a medicinal plant that actually had healing properties, but he'd also recite incantations and prescribe amulets to ward off evil. Some remedies were helpful. Honey, which has natural antibacterial properties, was used to treat wounds. Willow bark, which contains a compound similar to aspirin, was used for pain and inflammation. Castor oil was used as a laxative. But many treatments were useless at best and harmful at worst. Remedies included ingredients like crocodile dung, mouse tails, and fly excrement. These were thought to have magical properties that would drive out disease. Surgery was practiced, but without anesthesia or antiseptics, it was an ordeal. Imagine having a tooth extracted with nothing for pain, but perhaps a swig of beer. Or having a broken bone set while you're fully conscious, feeling every scrape of bone against bone. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, which we mentioned earlier, is one of the world's oldest surgical texts. It describes 48 cases, mostly involving head injuries and wounds. For each case, it gives the diagnosis and recommended treatment. Some treatments are remarkably sensible. For a broken collarbone, the physician is instructed to immobilize it and bandage it. For a dislocated jaw, he should manipulate it back into place. These are treatments that would still be used today. But other cases are grimmer. Several are labeled an ailment not to be treated. This means the injury was considered fatal and the physician should do nothing. No attempt at treatment, no comfort measures, just a diagnosis of death. Imagine being told this. You've suffered a serious injury. You're in pain, you're afraid. And the physician looks at you and essentially says, "You're going to die and there's nothing I can do." This was the reality of ancient medicine. There were limits, and beyond those limits, you were at the mercy of fate and the gods. Infectious diseases were particularly devastating because they couldn't be treated effectively. A wound might become infected, and without antibiotics, the infection could spread through the bloodstream, causing sepsis and death. Diseases like tuberculosis would slowly consume the patient over months or years. Malaria would return again and again, each bout weakening the sufferer further. And then there were epidemics, diseases that swept through populations, killing thousands. We don't have detailed records of these, but they certainly occurred. Plague, cholera, typhus, any of these could devastate a community, and the Egyptians would have had no idea how to stop the spread. They didn't know about quarantine or sanitation in the modern sense. The response to epidemics was often religious. Prayers and sacrifices to the gods, asking them to lift the curse, which is understandable if you don't know about germs and how disease spreads. Supernatural explanations make as much sense as anything else. Let's talk about something we've touched on but haven't explored fully, the environment itself. Egypt is mostly desert. The only habitable land is the narrow strip along the Nile and the delta where the river spreads out before reaching the Mediterranean Sea. This is the Black Land, named for the rich, dark soil left by the river's floods. Beyond the Black Land is the Red Land, the desert. Vast, empty, hostile to human life. The desert wasn't just empty space. It was home to dangers. Sandstorms could blow up suddenly, blinding and disorienting travelers. The fine sand would get into eyes, nose, mouth, and lungs. It could strip skin and suffocate animals. In summer, temperatures in the desert could exceed 120 degrees Fahrenheit. A person without water could die of dehydration within a day. Even in winter, the desert was dangerous. Nights could be bitterly cold. And then there were the creatures of the desert. We've mentioned scorpions and snakes, but there were also larger predators. Lions lived in Egypt until relatively recent times, hunting along the desert's edge. Hyenas would scavenge and occasionally attack humans. Wild dogs ran in packs. For Egyptians, the desert was a place of death. It was where the dead were buried, in the dry sand that naturally preserved bodies. It was where criminals were sent to die of exposure. It was where demons and hostile spirits were thought to dwell. But even the Black Land, the habitable zone, had its dangers. We've already mentioned crocodiles, but there were also hippos, which are among the most dangerous animals in Africa. Despite their bulky appearance, hippos are aggressive and unpredictable. They can run faster than a human and have jaws powerful enough to bite a person in half. Hippos were both feared and revered in ancient Egypt. The goddess Taweret, protector of women in childbirth, was depicted as a pregnant hippo standing upright. This is interesting. The most dangerous animal in the river was also associated with the dangerous process of giving birth. The Nile itself, while the source of life, was also unpredictable. Flash floods could occur with little warning. Canals and irrigation channels could overflow, drowning fields and villages. People who couldn't swim, and most Egyptians probably couldn't, were at constant risk when near water. And we can't forget the insects: mosquitoes carrying malaria, flies spreading disease, beetles destroying grain stores, locusts descending in swarms to devour crops, lice and fleas making everyone's lives miserable. Living in ancient Egypt meant constantly dealing with these environmental challenges. There was no escape from the heat, the pests, the dangers of the river and desert. This was your world, and you adapted as best you could or you died. Let's return once more to Khai, our imaginary farmer. We left him at the end of his ordinary day, falling asleep exhausted. But let's follow him a bit further. Let's see what else his life might contain. It's the month of Akhit, the flood season. The Nile has risen, covering the fields. Khai can't farm right now, which you might think would mean rest. But no, this is when the corvée labor happens. This is when the pharaohs' officials come to the villages and conscript workers for royal projects. Khai is selected. He has no choice in this. He must go where he's told and work for as long as he's needed. His family will have to survive without his labor, without his protection. Merit and the children will have to manage alone. Khai is sent to work on a tomb, not a pyramid. Those were built centuries ago in the Old Kingdom. This is the New Kingdom, and pharaohs are now buried in rock-cut tombs in the Valley of the Kings. Khai's job is to dig and haul, to remove rock from the tomb shaft, basket by basket, and carry it away. The work is mind-numbing. The tomb is being cut into solid rock. Workers with copper chisels pound away at the stone face, slowly advancing. Others, like Khai, haul away the debris. Down into the earth they dig, creating chambers that will eventually house the pharaoh's sarcophagus and grave goods. The tomb shaft is dark, lit only by oil lamps that smoke and make the air thick and hard to breathe. The work is dangerous. Rocks can fall, crushing workers. The air is bad, and men sometimes collapse from lack of oxygen. Cave-ins do happen, burying workers alive. Khai works here for 3 months. 3 months away from his family, sleeping in a barracks with dozens of other men, eating rations, working until his body screams for rest. Then, when the flood begins to recede and the growing season approaches, he's released to return to his village and his fields. This cycle repeats year after year. This is the price of living in the pharaoh's kingdom. Now let's imagine something worse. Let's imagine that the harvest is bad this year. The flood was low, and though Khai planted his barley, the crop was thin. When the tax collectors come, they take their share as always. But what's left isn't enough to feed Khai's family through the year. The months pass. The grain runs low. Merit carefully rations what they have, but it's not enough. The children start to lose weight. Their ribs become visible. They become listless, lacking the energy to play. Khai tries to find work, any work, to earn extra food, but everyone is in the same situation. There's no work to be found. He considers desperate measures. Should he sell himself into debt slavery? Should he sell one of the children? These aren't hypothetical questions. These are choices actual people had to make. Eventually, mercifully, the next flood comes and the next growing season. If they can just hold on a bit longer, if they can survive until the next harvest, they'll be all right. Maybe. Unless the next flood is also poor. Unless the next harvest also fails. This precariousness, this constant knife edge between survival and disaster, is what defined life for most ancient Egyptians. There was no safety net, no savings to fall back on, no social programs to help the desperate. There was only what you could grow or earn, and the charity of neighbors who were themselves barely surviving. Let's talk about old age. Because if you manage to survive childhood, avoid disease, escape famine, and not die in an accident or war, you might live to be old. But old age in ancient Egypt was not comfortable. First, understand that old age came early. Someone in their 40s would be considered old. The decades of hard labor, poor diet, and constant exposure to disease aged people rapidly. By the time you reached 50, your body was likely failing in multiple ways. Arthritis was nearly universal among older people. The constant bending, lifting, and repetitive motion of daily work wore out joints. Hips, knees, shoulders, and spines all deteriorated. Moving became painful. Work became impossible. And if you couldn't work, you became a burden. Eyesight failed. Without glasses or any treatment for cataracts or other eye conditions, many elderly people went partially or fully blind. Hearing declined. Teeth, as we've discussed, were often rotted or worn down to nothing, making eating difficult and painful. In theory, children were supposed to care for their aging parents. This was both a moral obligation and a practical necessity. There was no state pension, no retirement home. If your children didn't care for you, you would likely starve or die of neglect. But not everyone had children who survived to adulthood, and even those who did might find their children unable or unwilling to care for them. If times were hard, if food was scarce, an elderly mouth to feed was a liability. Some elderly people ended up begging. You'd see them in markets and outside temples, asking for charity. Some had no choice but to keep working, their bent bodies still laboring in fields or workshops because stopping meant death. The Egyptian concept of a good death was to die quickly, without prolonged suffering, and to have proper burial rites performed. But for many, death came slowly and miserably. Disease wasted the body over months. Injuries led to infections that slowly poisoned the blood. People died in pain, afraid, uncertain if their afterlife journey would be successful. Even burial was not guaranteed. A proper burial with mummification was expensive. Only the wealthy could afford the full process. Common people might have a simpler version, the body washed, wrapped in linen, buried in the sand. The very poorest might not even get that. Their bodies might be dumped in the desert, left for scavengers. And without proper burial, according to Egyptian belief, the soul might not reach the afterlife. This was the ultimate horror, to die and simply cease to exist, with no eternal life in the field of reeds. Let's talk more about Egyptian religion, because it was central to how people understood and coped with their harsh existence. The Egyptians believed in many gods, hundreds of them. Each had specific domains and powers. Ra, the sun god, traveled across the sky each day in his solar boat. Osiris ruled the underworld and judged the dead. Isis was the great mother, protector and healer. Horus, the falcon-headed god, was associated with kingship. Anubis, with the head of a jackal, guided souls through the afterlife. But beyond these major deities, there were countless minor guards and protective spirits. Every aspect of life had its divine overseer. There were guards of childbirth, guards of the Nile flood, guards of brewing beer, guards of writing and wisdom. This pantheon wasn't systematic or consistent. Different regions had different versions of myths. Guards merged and split and changed attributes over time. But what mattered to ordinary people wasn't theological consistency. What mattered was that the guards could be appealed to, bargained with, perhaps even manipulated through the right prayers and offerings. If your child was sick, you'd pray to Isis or Taweret. If you were going on a journey, you'd make offerings for protection. If you wanted a good harvest, you'd pray to the gods of agriculture and make sure to participate in the festivals honoring them. Magic and religion were intertwined. Amulets were worn for protection. Spells were recited to ward off evil. The boundary between the natural and supernatural was porous. Demons and spirits were real, present forces that could help or harm you. This magical worldview made sense in a world that seemed capricious and dangerous. Why did one child die while another lived? Why did crops fail one year and flourish the next? Why did some women die in childbirth while others survived? Without scientific understanding of cause and effect, supernatural explanations filled the gap. And the Egyptians developed elaborate practices to try to control, or at least influence, these supernatural forces. The Book of the Dead, a collection of spells and incantations, was placed in tombs to help the deceased navigate the afterlife. Protective spells were written on papyrus and worn as amulets. Priests performed daily rituals in temples to keep the guards satisfied and maintain cosmic order. For the common people, religion was both comfort and obligation. It provided hope that there was meaning in suffering, that there would be reward after death. But it also demanded constant vigilance. You had to perform the right rituals, say the right prayers, make the right offerings, or risk divine displeasure. Let's imagine a specific religious festival. It's the Apit festival, a major celebration that occurred annually during the flood season in Thebes. This festival honored Amun-Ra, the king of the gods, and was meant to renew the pharaoh's divine power. For weeks beforehand, preparations take place. Priests perform purification rituals. Sacred barks, ornate boats that carry statues of the gods, are cleaned and decorated. Food is prepared for offerings. Then the festival begins. The statue of Amun-Ra is carried out of the great temple at Karnak in its bark. Priests carry it on their shoulders, and a huge procession forms. The pharaoh himself participates, along with nobles, soldiers, musicians, and dancers. For ordinary people like Khai, this is one of the few times they might see the pharaoh in person. They line the route, watching the procession pass. It's a spectacle unlike anything else in their lives: the flash of gold, the sound of drums and sistrums, the chanting of priests, the smell of incense. The procession makes its way along the Nile to the temple at Luxor. This journey, normally a short walk, takes all day because of the stops for rituals and performances. Finally, the statue reaches the inner sanctuary of the temple. For several days, the festival continues. There are feasts, though most of the food goes to the priests and elite. There's beer distributed to the crowd. There are dances and performances. For a brief time, the grinding routine of daily life is suspended. For someone like Khai, this is a moment of joy and release. He can forget his worries, feel part of something larger than himself, feel connected to the divine order that supposedly governs the universe. But then the festival ends. The statue is returned to Karnak. The priests go back to their duties, and Khai returns to his field, his back, his endless labor. The festival was real, but it was also a brief illusion. The fundamental realities of his life haven't changed. This pattern, momentary relief from hardship, followed by return to suffering, characterized life for most ancient Egyptians. There were festivals and celebrations, moments of joy and community, but they were islands in a sea of toil. Let's talk about slavery more directly. We've mentioned it several times, but let's examine it more closely. Slavery in ancient Egypt wasn't quite like slavery in other societies. There was no massive slave trade bringing people from distant lands. Instead, most slaves were prisoners of war captured in military campaigns. Others were criminals or people who'd been enslaved for debt. Slaves had few rights. They could be bought, sold, inherited, or given as gifts. They could be beaten or killed by their owners with little to no legal consequence. They were property. But the conditions of slavery varied widely. A slave working as a domestic servant in a wealthy household might have a relatively tolerable existence, hard work, but regular food and shelter. These slaves might even be treated almost like family members by kind owners. At the other extreme were slaves sent to work in mines or quarries. This was essentially a death sentence. The conditions in places like the gold mines of the eastern desert were horrific beyond description. Slaves worked underground in narrow tunnels, breathing dust-filled air, their bodies wasting away from malnutrition and exhaustion. Life expectancy in the mines could be measured in months. There are descriptions of mine workers from later ancient sources that probably reflect conditions that existed in Egyptian times as well. Workers chained in dark tunnels, barely fed, working until they literally dropped dead. Their bodies carried out and dumped, replaced by new slaves in an endless cycle. Even on farms or building sites, slaves were pushed to their limits. They were an investment to be used up, not people to be cared for. If a slave died, the owner had lost property, but slaves were cheap enough that working them to death was economically rational. Some slaves could gain freedom. In rare cases, an owner might free a slave in their will. A slave might earn enough money, yes, some slaves were paid small amounts to buy their freedom. But for most, slavery was permanent, a condition they'd die in. Children of slaves were also slaves, so the system perpetuated itself across generations. If you were born to a slave mother, you were born into bondage. Now we should note that not all forced laborers were slaves. As we discussed, many Egyptians owed corvée labor mandatory work for the state. In practice, the distinction between corvée labor and slavery could be slim. You were forced to work. You had no choice. You were punished if you refused. Whether you were technically free or not, your actual lived experience was one of compulsion. Let's shift topics again. Let's talk about women's lives in more detail. In some ways, ancient Egyptian women had more rights than women in other ancient societies. They could own property, initiate divorce, conduct business, serve as priestesses. Some women even became pharaohs, like Hatshepsut in the 15th century BC. But these rights were largely theoretical for most women. A peasant woman like Merit owned no property, had no business to conduct, no opportunity for religious office. Her life was defined by domestic labor and childbearing. Women's work was essential but undervalued. Grinding grain, baking bread, brewing beer, weaving cloth, these tasks took hours every day and were physically demanding. But they were seen as simply what women did, not as skilled labor deserving of recognition or compensation. Girls received little to no formal education. They learned from their mothers how to run a household. Reading and writing were skills for elite men and a few scribes. The vast majority of women were illiterate. Marriage was expected. A girl who didn't marry was pitied or viewed with suspicion. But marriages were arranged, usually by fathers. A girl might be married to a much older man or to a relative to keep property in the family. Her consent was not required. Within marriage, women were subordinate to their husbands. A man could take multiple wives if he could afford to support them. He could divorce his wife relatively easily. A woman could also initiate divorce, but it was more difficult and socially stigmatized. Domestic violence was likely common, though it's hard to know for certain. There was no concept of marital rape. A wife's body belonged to her husband. Physical punishment of wives was probably accepted within limits. And women faced unique dangers. We've discussed childbirth, but there was also the danger of unwanted pregnancy. Without reliable contraception, women had limited control over their own fertility. There were folk methods, pessaries made of honey and acacia, herbal concoctions, but their effectiveness was questionable. Abortion was known but dangerous. Without sterile instruments or antibiotics, attempts to end a pregnancy could lead to infection and death. Women who were widowed faced difficult prospects. If they had grown sons, they might be cared for, but a widow with only daughters or no children might struggle to survive. Remarriage was an option but not always available. Women who never married or who were divorced and couldn't remarry were vulnerable. Without male protection, they were easy targets for exploitation or abuse. Some turned to prostitution, the only way they could earn money independently. And of course, poor women, slave women, had it worst of all. They could be sexually exploited by their owners or any man with power over them. They had no recourse, no protection. This is a harsh picture, and it's important not to overgeneralize. Some women probably had happy marriages, supportive families, satisfying lives. The records that survive tend to emphasize the problems and tragedies. Happy, ordinary lives left fewer traces. But the structural inequalities were real. Women had less power, less autonomy, more vulnerability. This was built into the fabric of society. Let's talk about justice and law, because ancient Egypt did have a legal system, courts, judges. In theory, even a peasant could bring a case against a noble. In practice, justice was heavily weighted toward the powerful. Legal disputes were heard by local councils or, in important cases, by judges appointed by the pharaoh. Evidence was presented, witnesses testified. In some cases, defendants were tortured to extract confessions. The thinking was that a person under torture would tell the truth rather than endure more pain. For certain crimes, punishments were severe. We've discussed tomb robbery, but other crimes also carried harsh penalties. Murder could be punished by execution or mutilation. Adultery by a wife could be punished by having her nose cut off, a permanent mark of shame. Theft might result in beatings or amputation of hands. But enforcement was uneven. If you were wealthy or well-connected, you might bribe your way out of trouble. If you were poor and powerless, you had no defense against accusations, fair or false. There are records of legal disputes over property, inheritance, contracts. These show that the legal system could function to resolve disputes, at least among the property-owning classes. But for the vast majority who own nothing, the law was something to be feared, not a source of protection. Corrupt officials were a constant problem. Tax collectors could demand more than was owed, pocketing the difference. Judges could be bribed. Scribes could alter records, and the victims of this corruption had no recourse. In theory, the pharaoh was the ultimate source of justice, the guarantor of mad. Any subject could, in theory, appeal directly to the pharaoh for justice. In practice, the pharaoh was remote, inaccessible, surrounded by layers of officials and courtiers. An ordinary person had about as much chance of reaching the pharaoh as they did of flying. So justice, like everything else in ancient Egypt, was distributed according to power and wealth. Those who had it could buy or compel justice. Those who didn't were at the mercy of the powerful. Let's return once more to the central fact of Egyptian life, the Nile. The river gave life. Its annual floods replenished the soil. Its waters allowed agriculture in the midst of desert. Its fish provided protein. Its papyrus reeds were made into paper, boats, sandals, baskets. The Nile made Egypt possible. But the Nile also took life. It drowned those who ventured too close. It harbored diseases. Its floods could be too high or too low, bringing disaster either way. The Egyptians understood this duality. They deified the river, worshipping Hapi, the god of the flood. They prayed for a good inundation, not too much, not too little. They built Nilometers to measure the river's height, hoping to predict whether the flood would be sufficient. But ultimately, they were at the river's mercy. They couldn't control it. They could only adapt, hope, and pray. This relationship with the Nile is a metaphor for the Egyptian relationship with life itself. Life gave and took away. You couldn't control it. You could only endure, adapt, and hope for the best. And perhaps, if you performed the right rituals and lived according to Ma'at, you'd be rewarded in the afterlife. This brings us to the concept of Ma'at, which we've mentioned several times, but haven't fully explained. Ma'at is usually translated as truth, justice, or cosmic order. It's the principle that keeps the universe functioning properly. The sun rises and sets. The Nile floods. The seasons turn. Society is hierarchical, with Pharaoh at the top. These are all part of Ma'at. To live according to Ma'at means to accept your place in this order, to do your duty, to not disturb the balance. For a farmer, this means working your field, paying your taxes, serving when called upon. For a pharaoh, it means ruling justly, performing religious rituals, defending Egypt's borders. The opposite of Ma'at is Isfit, chaos, disorder, injustice. Isfit is the primordial chaos that existed before creation and constantly threatens to return. It's the desert encroaching on the Nile Valley. It's rebellion and civil war. It's the failure of the flood. It's death and decay. The pharaoh's primary job was to maintain Ma'at and keep Isfit at bay. Every ritual he performed, every temple he built, every enemy he defeated was in service of this goal. For ordinary people, Ma'at provided a framework for understanding their lives. Yes, life was hard. Yes, it was unfair. But this was the cosmic order. Your suffering had meaning. It was your role to endure, and if you did so righteously, you'd be rewarded after death. This ideology, of course, served to maintain the status quo. If you're taught that the social hierarchy is ordained by the gods, that your poverty and suffering are part of cosmic order, you're less likely to rebel. Ma'at was a tool of social control as much as it was a spiritual principle. But it's also worth noting that Ma'at included concepts of justice and compassion. The ideal was that the powerful should protect the weak, that justice should be available to all, that cruelty and exploitation were violations of Ma'at. In practice, these ideals were often ignored, but they existed, and they provided a basis for criticism of unjust rulers. If a pharaoh was seen as violating Ma'at, ruling cruelly, failing in his duties, he could lose legitimacy. Several periods in Egyptian history saw the collapse of central authority and the breakdown of social order. Historians call these the intermediate periods. During these times, Egypt fragmented into rival kingdoms. Famine and violence were widespread. These were periods when Isfit seemed to have triumphed over Ma'at. The inscriptions from these periods reflect the horror people felt. One text describes people eating their own children. Another describes the breakdown of social hierarchy, with the poor becoming rich and the rich becoming poor, not celebrated as justice, but described as evidence of chaos. Eventually, a strong pharaoh would reunite Egypt, restore order, and Ma'at would be re-established. The cycle would begin again. This cyclical view of history, order, chaos, restoration reflected the Egyptian experience. The Nile's annual cycle of flood, planting, harvest, the daily cycle of the sun's journey, birth, life, death, and rebirth in the afterlife. Everything was cycles within cycles. Let's talk about one more aspect of daily life: childhood and education. For most children, education meant learning to do what your parents did. A farmer's son learned to farm. A potter's daughter learned to make pottery. This was done through observation and practice, starting from a young age. Children began helping with household tasks as soon as they were able. A 4-year-old might feed chickens or fetch water. By age 7 or 8, children were doing significant work. By puberty, they were doing adult work. Play existed but was limited. Children had toys, balls, dolls, wooden animals. They played games. But play was not seen as important for development the way it is in modern societies. It was something you did when you had spare time, which wasn't often. For a tiny minority, the children of nobles and officials, formal education was possible. Boys might attend scribal schools where they learned to read and write hieroglyphs, as well as arithmetic, geometry, and other skills needed for administration. This education was rigorous and based on memorization and copying. Students would spend hours copying texts, learning proper forms. Discipline was strict. Teachers would beat students who made mistakes or didn't pay attention. The education system existed to perpetuate the bureaucracy. It trained the next generation of scribes and officials. It was not about fostering creativity or critical thinking. It was about maintaining the system. Girls, even elite girls, rarely received formal education. There were exceptions. Some priestesses were literate. Some royal daughters learned to read. But it was uncommon. For the vast majority of children, illiteracy was simply a fact of life. They lived in a world full of written texts, inscriptions on temples, administrative records, magical spells, but couldn't read them. They were dependent on scribes to navigate this textual world. This created another layer of inequality. Those who could read and write had access to knowledge and opportunity that the illiterate lacked. Literacy was power, and it was concentrated in a small elite. Let's imagine the end of Khai's life. He's 45 years old. By ancient Egyptian standards, this is old. His body is worn out from decades of hard labor. His back is permanently bent. His joints ache constantly. His teeth are ruined. He wakes one morning feeling worse than usual. His chest hurts. He has trouble breathing. He tries to work, but he's too weak. He returns to his home and lies down. Merit calls for the local healer. The man comes, examines Khai, makes a diagnosis. He's been infected by an evil spirit. The healer prepares a potion, herbs, honey, and other ingredients. He recites spells. He places an amulet on Khai's chest. But Khai doesn't improve. Over the next few days, he grows weaker. The pain in his chest increases. His breathing becomes more labored. He develops a fever. Khai knows he's dying. He's seen enough death to recognize it. He thinks about his life, the endless work, the children he's lost, the hunger and fear, but also the small joys, the taste of fresh bread, the laughter of his surviving children, the comfort of Merit's presence beside him at night. He thinks about the afterlife. Will he reach the field of reeds? Will his heart be light enough to pass the judgment of Osiris? He's tried to live rightly, to uphold Mad, but he's not sure it's enough. On the 5th day of his illness, Khai dies. His family washes his body. They don't have money for elaborate mummification, but they do what they can. They wrap him in linen. They place a few humble grave goods with him, his favorite cup, a small amulet, some bread and beer for the journey. They carry his body to the cemetery at the edge of the desert. They dig a simple grave and lower him into it. They pray for his soul. They weep. Then they return to the village and the work of living, because life goes on. Merit will struggle to support herself and her children alone. She might remarry if she can find a man willing to take on a widow with children. Or she might struggle on alone, her children working to help support the family. Khai is gone. In a generation or two, he'll be forgotten entirely. No monument marks his life. No inscription records his name. He's simply one of the millions who lived and died along the Nile, leaving no trace. And yet, in a sense, Khai and people like him built Egypt. They tilled the fields that fed the nation. They paid the taxes that funded the temples and monuments. They were the foundation on which the entire civilization rested. The pharaohs, the priests, the nobles, they get the attention. Their names are remembered. Their monuments still stand. But without the Khais of Egypt, none of it would have existed. This is the paradox at the heart of ancient Egypt, one of history's greatest civilizations, built on the suffering of millions of forgotten people. As you drift towards sleep tonight, perhaps you'll think about this, about the vast gap between the Egypt of popular imagination, golden and glorious, and the Egypt that actually existed, harsh and unforgiving for most who lived there. Both are true. Egypt produced art and architecture of stunning beauty. It developed sophisticated systems of writing, mathematics, and administration. It endured for 3,000 years. But it also exploited and brutalized its own people. It was built on forced labor and slavery. It maintained stark inequalities that condemned most people to lives of poverty and toil. We can appreciate the achievements while also acknowledging the costs. We can marvel at the pyramids while also mourning the workers who died building them. History is complex. Civilizations are complex. They contain multitudes, beauty and horror, achievement and suffering, all intertwined. Ancient Egypt was not a simple story of glory. It was a complicated human story, with all the light and shadow that implies. As the night deepens and your breathing slows, let your mind wander through these ancient landscapes. See the Nile flowing eternally through the desert. See the workers in the fields, the builders at the monuments, the children playing in village streets. See the priests in their temples, the pharaohs in their palaces, the dead in their tombs. All of them part of this great civilization. All of them struggling with the fundamental challenges of human existence. All of them seeking meaning, seeking survival, seeking something beyond the hardship of daily life. They lived and died thousands of years ago, but in some ways they're not so different from us. We still struggle. We still seek meaning. We still hope for something better, if not in this life, then in whatever comes after. The ancient Egyptians believed that speaking the name of the dead kept them alive. In some small way, perhaps, we've done that tonight. We've remembered them, not the famous ones, but the ordinary ones. The farmers and weavers, the workers and mothers, the forgotten millions. Rest well, dear listener. Let the weight of the day fall away. Let your mind quiet. The Nile still flows, the sun still rises, and life, in all its difficulty and beauty, continues. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges, but tonight you can rest. Sleep deeply, sleep peacefully, and perhaps in your dreams you'll walk beside the ancient river and hear the echoes of voices long silent. Good night.